And we've invited two leading voices to give their thoughts at the end of our quick review of tremendously difficult problems, but also some, I suppose, possibilities of action. In the first place, I would like to present Mrs. Marcella Panucci, who is Director General of Confindustria, which is the only one really employers organization in Italy, and which is, of course, a very important voice in this country's policies and debate and dialogue. She was born in Vibo, Valencia, which is not the Spanish Valencia, no?
It's not. It's Italian.
It's Italian. She graduated from Luis Guido Carli University of Rome.
Thanks for not telling my age.
Well, you can. We can see you are very young. She participated in research programs at the University College of London, at the University of Perugia. She started at Confindustria in 1995. She worked also at the Director General Competition of the European Commission in Brussels. She was in charge of the Finance and Company Law Department of Confindustria since 2001. In 2009, she was appointed Director of the Legislative Affairs Department, and since 2012, she is Director General of Confindustria. She's also on the board of directors of Il Sole 24 Ore, the main economic media and voice here in Italy, and also member of the Corporate Governance Committee of the Italian Stock Exchange. Marcella.
After this amazing presentation, thanks a lot for passing me the floor. I will try and speak English, but I ask you to allow me to skip to Italian if I should need it. Really thank you for inviting me to this very important conference. I read the papers that have been presented during these 2 days, and they are really incredibly interesting from many points of view. I will focus on a few issues during my speech, which are the issues we are dealing with during the recent years, and probably on which I can give let's say, support to the conclusions of the conference. I would like to start from the context, which is quite complex at the moment. We are facing a crisis of the doctrine of globalization. Globalization has produced very important results, very positive effects. If we look at the differences between the countries, inequalities between countries have been reduced in a very strong way. Third world countries are starting to improve from an economic point of view, from a GDP point of view. But globalization has increased inequalities within the countries, especially within Western countries. And this is probably due to the coincidence with the financial crisis that the world has faced since 2008, which has created many problems from the public budget point of view. So the social expense has been cut in many Western countries, and this has had a significant impact on the welfare status of the different countries. So there has been a fragmentation, and there has been a growing unemployment with growing inequalities. The person who intervened before me was speaking about people who are richer and people who are poorer, and this is a situation that we are experiencing in Europe as well as in other economic areas. And that is creating a strong unsatisfaction. At the same time, we have had some giant countries that have started competing on the world arena. I'm thinking about China, for example, who is always more specialized in high-quality productions and competing with typical European and US productions. And of course, this has somehow created further problems in these economies with job losses in more traditional industrial sectors like the steel sector, for example, just to quote an example. And of course, this is even more creating unsatisfaction in these countries. The third, let's say, condition is an important and positive one, which is the technology revolution. We call it 4.0 revolution, which is going on in many countries, especially the most advanced countries, and which poses a very important question, which is the role of the person, of men, within the high-tech revolution. And I would like to start from here, commenting some of the papers that have been presented during these 2 days. And one in particular was quite important because it was speaking about the man as the center of innovation, of the productive process. And we do share this view, which is quite important, and which was somehow saying that artificial intelligence wouldn't exist without human intelligence. The two are strictly connected, but the artificial intelligence is a consequence of the human intelligence and not the contrary. And I think that never can be the contrary, because without men there is no other form of intelligence. We are, of course, conscious of the impact that the 4.0 revolution will create on jobs, on the production, on the productive process, but we are quite optimistic because, as well as all the other industrial revolutions that we have faced, the three previous industrial revolutions that have created new jobs and improved the life condition of huge parts of the populations all over the world. We are confident that also the 4.0 revolution will have the same effect. It will create more jobs than the ones that will be destroyed by this kind of revolution. And in one of the papers that have been presented during these days, there was the correct way of analyzing this sort of revolution, which is strictly connected to innovation. Innovation raises productivity, and productivity lowers the cost of production and gives more bargaining power to the people, to consumers, and this raises consumptions and raises jobs because people consume more, industries produce more, they employ more people, so there will be, as a net effect, more jobs. And of course, we experienced it in the past with the first, the second, and the third revolution. They all had this sort of effect. The problem is that there is a mismatch between job loss and job creation, because this revolution requires new skills, new competencies. And it's not, let's say, said that the current workers in companies do have all the skills which are required by the new revolution. So the problem is how to deal with this kind of industrial transformation that we are already facing, because we are seeing that companies are investing in Italy as well as in Europe and in all the other countries of the world in new technologies, new machineries, and this is a very important move towards innovation and towards a new kind of production. We think that the responsibility for dealing with the mismatch in the labor market is a collective responsibility, which means, I don't mean that there is no responsibility. I think that the responsibility is, of course, of the person, the worker, who must be available to change the way of working and to learn new way of working. The responsibilities of the companies who have to invest in the skill of the workers, so to allow workers to be educated in order to face the changing in the job market, and the responsibilities of the governments who have to invest in preparing workers to change and not only in repairing. We are convinced that the social expense must be changed and recomposed in order to meet these new needs. So passing from, we call them passive policies, to active policies, investing in schools, in education, in universities, investing in workers and companies. And only through this kind of investment we are sure that the problem of job destruction and job creation can be managed. Of course, public resources are limited, and we all know this. And we think that the public policymaker should take decisions and find out which are the priorities they have to face with. And if they do, and they share this point of view that it's important to prepare people, and it's important to offer means to persons in order to allow them to reconcile the family with the work and allow women to enter the job market as well as young people to do so, or persons that have to change, that lose the job to find a new one, they have to put aside the unproductive expense, which is usually the expense which is faced by the state when the state wants to be an entrepreneur and it occupies spaces which should be left to the market, and invest in policies aimed at instructing and educating people. We think that this would have another important effect, raising the level of competition, which comes from competere, which means searching together. So it's a question of collectivity. And this would incentive new economic initiative. A new economic initiative brings to new jobs, brings to more freedom, brings to a modern democracy. So we think that, to conclude my presentation, we are sure that the fourth industrial revolution, the new technologies, innovations, will create some difficulties in the short term because they have to be governed. And, but we believe that in the long term, more benefits will be given to persons, to companies, and to the state in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Panucci, and that's important to know that Italian employers have this word of common responsibility as their aim in this difficult transformation, which means also responsibility for each of the employers and each of the persons who somehow participate in the firm, in each company. It's not easy to do. It's easy to say. It's not easy to do, but it's important to say. So thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask Archbishop Diarmuid-Martin to have his final thoughts, also to present his final thoughts to our conference. Archbishop Martin is, well, I may say he's born in April 1945, which is fine because he's a son of peace like me. We're the same month, end of the Second World War. He studied at the University College in Dublin. He was ordained in 1969. He studied at the St. Thomas Aquinas University in Rome, and he entered the service of the Holy See in 1976, first in the Council for the Family, and then he was Undersecretary and Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. That's when we first met a few years ago, before the year 2000. And then he was ordained bishop by Pope John Paul II in 1999, and then he was representative of the Holy See in Geneva at the United Nations office, and finally he was appointed Archbishop of Dublin, where he succeeded his predecessor in 2004. Archbishop Martin is a friend of Centesimus Annus. We have had his presence several times in the past, especially in what we call the Dublin process, not by chance, because part of it started in Dublin. And it continues, and we've had since then always his input, and now we are very pleased that he is present also here in Rome, in carne ed ossa, and that he will address us for this final speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Just two reflections on the discussions this morning on international crime and human trafficking. Last year, 7 people were shot down within 2 miles of my residence in central Dublin by a ruthless drug trafficking group with roots in the Netherlands, Spain, and in Russia. An extraordinary example of the arrogance towards democracy of an international drug trade, which thinks it can simply do what it likes in society. And this morning we have news of another example of a particular group of people being trafficked in to Ireland, and that is fishermen. That they come, they spend their lives on boats, they have no rights. One man got seriously ill, and he was simply dispatched on a boat to find his own way to hospital. They're the realities. The last session just now, I was thinking of corporate social responsibility, and you might like to know who was the first firm in Ireland to have established a creche for children, or who opened the first public swimming pool in Ireland, and who ran the first project for privately supported social housing in Ireland, and who was the pioneer of apprenticeship, leading young people who left school at a young age, maybe even bringing them to university. And that was Guinness. So I would say there you have an example of corporate social responsibility, of a business which produces a product which created much social irresponsibility in society. I want to talk about something that Bishop Paul was saying. How do we encourage, incentivize people to do what they know they should do? And I want to talk about a thing called public opinion. I'll give you an example. In 1995, I led the Vatican delegation to what at that stage was the largest gathering of heads of state and government in history, a social summit, a summit on social development. And I was asked in my instructions to have a reference in the documents to that of that conference to the social damage caused by landmines, particularly in countries which were trying to get away from the horrors of war. And I was told under no circumstances. I was told this is a conference on social development. Disarmament questions can be left to our colleagues and their own much more arcane negotiations. I did finally get a phrase inserted, but if you read it, you probably would not know what it was really about. The phrase was, certain conventional weapons which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects. that is actually the name of a treaty. And because the countries had signed that treaty, they couldn't object to its presence. But I tell the story because 2 years later, there was a full-blown international treaty outlawing the use of landmines in Ottawa. So what happened in the meantime? Had I converted the unrepentant? No. Public opinion had changed, and it had changed dramatically, so that now it was, in talking about landmines, it was far better to be on the side of the saints. Public opinion can form and greatly influence the common ethics of business, the ethical framework of a nation, or indeed of international affairs. And the Ottawa Landmine Treaty was an interesting one. Many military experts had their doubts about the wisdom of a treaty. But there comes a moment in public opinion when anybody watching the tide of public opinion realizes that you're best to cut your losses and go with the changed stream of public opinion. The price of doing so will be too costly. Ethics and ethical behaviour in business march with the times and develop with the times. The major changes can come through public opinion changing. Look at the classic ones: fight against slavery, the estimation of the role of women, the question of child labour. At times, the change in public opinion can actually surprise the pragmatic. You take, for example, the ban on smoking in public places in Ireland. Nobody would dare smoke in a restaurant in Ireland today. Or the other one, which probably surprised many of us, the obligation to wear seatbelts. Many said it won't work. There are many pragmatic reasons to think that an absolute ban would never work, and that perhaps some compromise would be the best way of moving forward. But an idea whose time has come, and which is being swept by the tide of public opinion, becomes impossible to resist. And curiously, the total ban or the total imposition becomes easier to sell than compromise. But for public opinion to change, you need forerunners. You need men and women of intuition and innovation and courage and conviction, who are prepared to take with determination a stand, and a principled stand, and an uncompromising stand. In the complex business of politics, the art of compromise is an essential part of day-to-day ability to move forward. But the level of compromise which becomes acceptable is determined by those who do not compromise. Democracy requires another presence in society than that in which everything is decided by majorities. The Thatcher government attempted on more than one occasion to reintroduce the death penalty, and there was solid public support in the country, but members of Parliament voted against it. An ethic which built on compromise alone will always be weak. Cheap ethics is of no avail to anyone. Veneer ethics is useless. In a society where compromise is the order of the day, and where many dislike the dogmatic, or dislike the inflexible, or reject any concept of the absolute, we need the uncompromising. That said, public opinion is a two-edged sword. Public opinion can be manipulated, can be emotional rather than rational. It can treat superficially and reduce to apparent simplicity situations which are in fact quite complex. The judgment of public opinion is a blunt tool with very little space for subtle details, and that is a problem we have seen today in the rise of populism, and how easily public opinion can be manipulated with regard to populism, and how we have a new range of political parties which have very little to propose, but can gather populism by being against. The twin brother of populism is spin. Spin is about not just creating fake desires, but even in making us think that there are fake outcomes, which we believe in. You can win many battles with spin, but spin in the long run weakens victory of the real war, which is about trust and confidence. When spin gets out of control, then it gets tied up in knots. People are left adrift, not knowing where they stand, where truth is to be found, and the confidence in institutions is weakened. When that occurs in public institutions and in public life, then the consequences of a failure in trust are serious. Spin is rarely the friend of transparency. Ethics must have an independent foundation. Ethics is not an ideology or just a pragmatic program of ideas. The very nature of ethics is that personal responsibility must be at its centre. We are responsible for the foreseeable consequences of our acts, and independent responsibility is always at the heart of ethical behaviour. Ethics is not an ideology that we trot out when we want to. It's not a mission statement which we can frame. It's not a handbook of do's and don'ts. It's about the responsible application of fundamental ethical principles to the decisions we make. In the long term, a just society is attained, again as we heard in the last session, by people who live justly and with integrity. In corporate governance, the concept of personal responsibility is central. It can be very easy to say that I did not know, the blame is with someone else. When things go wrong, and this happens in the church also, resignations take place at the lower levels. When I was faced with the scandals of child sexual abuse, I was very disappointed to be confronted with what I call the baking the cake culture. I only put in the sugar. I only put in the flour. Neither of us have any responsibility for the cake because we weren't there when it was put into the oven. We're all responsible for the foreseeable consequences of our actions and our omissions. Real corporate responsibility can only be constructed on the foundation of an acute sense of personal responsibility. Ethics requires governance and regulation and enforcement, because we live in a world of human beings and where corruption will always be found in the order of the day. And it should be noted that one of the most common forms of corruption is inefficiency, which robs people, especially the poorest and the most vulnerable, of quality services which are their democratic due and for which they will pay anyway. In that sense, there should be no real conflict or tension between ethics and effective leadership and management of an organisation. One final question. What can and should a religious leader say in this situation? Should I leave it to the experts and return to the sacristy? Can religious values influence economic and social stability? The job of the Christian churches is to preach the message of the gospel. And this is a message which is addressed to every individual and that has social implications for people who follow the message of Jesus. The basic message of Christian churches is about the love of God. And there are two characteristics of the love of God which I believe are particularly interesting in the modern world. One is gratuity. God loves people without any preconditions. Take the story of the prodigal son who returns home. He has his little negotiating speak ready, but he doesn't get the chance to use it because his father is there with his arms open. And the other is superabundance. The love of God is such that it surprises you. It's generous, and it's so generous that it turns you head over heels. These two values stand in contrast to a market-driven consumer society in which everything is precisely measured out. If the label says 16 ounces, you won't get an ounce more. You might get an ounce less. But if we truly lived in an environment like that, where you only got what you paid for and nothing beyond, none of us would be here today. We're all here because someone gave us a break. because someone put enough trust in us to give us a chance, because people gave themselves for us. So the world and an economy needs the values that create generosity, that make you care about another person, even when the person is weak, and that motivate you to really make an investment in the capacities, the God-given capacities of others, so we can all flourish together. Thank you.
No, many thanks, Archbishop. And, well, these thoughts, we'll read them again and again, because I think they are important to understand what we are here for, and that whatever our pretentious efforts, we have to think of what we've received before. That's a very strong idea. Dr. Tiliakos reminds me, and he asks me to remind you, that tomorrow morning you have to come with your badges to get into the Vatican, into the Sala Regia, and to the audience at the Clementina, and also to the, for those of us who go to the visit of La Specola Vaticana. Now, we've been here to discuss new models for an inclusive economy, which was what Pope Francis put us as a task last year. Well, that's impossible to do in 1 year, but in 1 year we've continued thinking about constructive alternatives at a time of turmoil, which is really the title of our conference this year. Of course, and Lord Skidelski's many questions about ethics and economics show that perhaps it's easier to ask the question than find the answers, but it's important to start asking the right questions, and in that sense I think our conference may have been important in the process of this brief we received from the Pope. But then, what is the way forward? What do we take away from the conference? I don't know. Each of us will take away probably different things. For me, it is on the first subject, there is certainly things which can be done relatively at short term about professional training, reinvented, renewed, to help solve the reconversion and the inclusion of young unemployed or of old unemployed. So that's, I mean, all the previous reflections are necessary, but then there are some actions which are clearly necessary. On the second theme, I think, for me at least, we need to recognize the facts of organized crime, which is not easy. So we have to recognize this information, and we have to understand that personal responsibility in different ways is a very specific problem today, as we've heard about anonymous use of the dark internet, about unregistered children in millions, or at least hundreds of thousands, I don't know the figures, but it is certainly an enormous problem in Africa, and responsible use of media. And in all this area, as Archbishop Diamo just said, the change of opinion is important. So that is something we can help, changing opinion around us. And, of course, working for a much stronger movement of solidarity. And one of the possible tools we've just heard, which is being developed right now. So, just words of thanks now to the interpreters. As usual, we can't see them, but they are very important. To the to the ladies of the green foulard, or how do you call it? very nicely helping all those 2 days. And of course, we can't see them, but Dr. Tiliakos will transmit to them to his assistants. Paula, Julia is here, Paula and Irene, because they do most of the work. So, and during months and months to allow us to be here. So congratulations and thank you, and we'll see each other tomorrow morning.